The sun went down like a $10 whore, as did the booze I downed. The only thing that wouldn't stay down was the memory of my old boss Capone. Things weren't the same since he was locked up, and I wasn't the one to bury Ness. I'm sorry, Alphonse.
Undertaker, are you talking about your backstory again? This isn't the Greasy Gamer show, you know!
Sorry, I guess old habits die hard. Much like myself. Much like Ness.
Jesus wept. I wish I'd never told him about the game we're reviewing today. This is Blues and Bullets.
As you may already be aware, I'm a big fan of gangster flicks and games, and one of my favourite time periods in history was the Prohibition era of the so-called Roaring Twenties. In between the devastating First World War and on the brink of the Second, America was fighting a whole new kind of battle on its own turf. The battle for booze. But you're not here for a history lesson, so I recommend you check out the film The Untouchables for what seems to be an accurate and action-packed blast to the past. Plus, it'll help you understand loads of the events in this game, such as the relationship between Al Capone and Elliot Ness. Blues and Bullets takes place 20 years after the downfall of the Untouchables, where the retired police commissioner Elliot Ness has opened up a diner to escape his whiskey-soaked and blood-stained past. That is, until he's needed for an ongoing case, the one that he was disgraced for because it wasn't solved, leading to his retirement. Children are going missing all over Santa Esperanza, and lately a younger relative of Al Capone's has too, made especially weird when he put them in a boarding school with a false name, and yet someone has still managed to kidnap them with the proper paperwork required. Ness, whether he likes it or not, takes up the job to find her.
I'm not going to help you.
I'm not asking you to help me. I'm asking you to rescue a little girl. Forget that her surname is Capone. Her name is Sophia. She's 8 years old and smart as a whip.
Okay, you win. I'll help. Not for you, for her.
Now before I move on to the gameplay, I need to tell you that I don't play many adventure games, especially this kind. The last time I did was about 2 years ago with Heavy Rain, so you'll forgive my lack of understanding when it comes to similar games like The Walking Dead and The Wolf Among Us. At least now I don't have much in the way of expectations and ideas of what other games do. So what exactly do you do in Blues and Bullets? In order to solve the case of occult murders and child nappings, you have to walk around, look at objects, and talk to people. No, that's all that's required. As a detective, you'll use your powers of observation to interact with items in the environment and get a description of them. Most of the time this is irrelevant and just adds fluff to the atmospheric and suspicious world of Santa Esperanza, but when playing as a detective I can't help but figure out how they're relevant to my current case and see if they lead to anything significant.
If it wasn't for my habit of checking all possible exits when I walk into the lion's den, I'd be a dead man.
Sadly, the case with this game is that the player is more clever and investigative than itself. A big problem I found with Murdered Soul Suspect. An inherent flaw with adventure games is that you have to figure out someone else's idea of what should happen in the story, and sometimes that can be too easy or too cryptic. The really important part when changing the route of the story is talking, and in this first episode it doesn't really do that much. I mean, I won't know until episodes 2 to 5 are released. Unlike pre-Telltale adventure games like Broken Sword or Grim Fandango, every NPC you encountered could be spoken to and would have vital clues as to what to do next. Unfortunately, that's not quite the case here because, you know, being a detective, you don't ask potential witnesses about clues for your current investigation. Instead, you'll only engage in dialogue when the game deems it necessary for the story, and in a way I actually appreciate this approach in a more linear experience like this one. You can't really go wrong with the dialogue, and perhaps that's for the best even if it does lower the stakes, but it's great to shape Ness and the people around him by making them react differently, and one of the cool features is that you can compare your own choices to the people around the world's. Another segment of gameplay is the action sequences, one being in the style of a third-person shooter and the other in quick-time events. The shooter style's okay, but it lacks an ammo count or the ability to reload and decent hit detection, plus I'm never really sure how much more damage I can take before I have to restart. The quick-time events are pretty self-explanatory. Hit the correct button in time and the action sequence you're supposed to be thrilled by will be over sooner. Thankfully these are kept to a minimum, and besides some of the quick-fire rounds and dialogue, I only counted one in this episode. One final feature which I really wanted to like was the detective-style gameplay, but unfortunately it suffers the same problems as Murdered Soul Suspect. You have to pick the key clues, and if you choose the wrong ones, you don't actually suffer any consequences. Not even something as insignificant as Condemn's alternate dialogue. And while I deduced here Watson mode has never been done perfectly in a video game before, at least I have a system where I need to think about it. All you do is just click on the items you found at the scene of a crime on the board screen, and they'll only be matched up with the crime if they're correct. So basically, no matter what, you'll always be right. I get that it's because the game wants to tell its own story and that changes in dialogue or different outcomes could harm it, but last I checked, Heavy Rain did that perfectly fine. I know a lot of people didn't like that game, and I'll be honest, 40 different endings is just a bucket of crusty spunk, but I like how David Cage changes the story to suit your choices, not the other way around. It's this mode which epitomizes what I mean by trying to figure out someone else's idea of what's supposed to happen. Like I should be, I wandered around the house picking up clues and trying to solve the murder without the crime board, and while it did make sense in the end, I still felt my story was just as valid. The first episode of Blues and Bullets ended shortly after that feature anyway, and just after the credits there was an additional bit of gameplay where you reflect on your choices in the first chapter. It's pretty grim, but cleverly done. I just thought I'd add that as an addendum, and a solid cliffhanger to this pilot episode.
It's time now to talk about the graphics and the soundtrack.
Do you like lens flares? No? Well, this game does, and for no reason, the distracting red, blurry lights find an excuse to be placed all around the game, even when there's nothing red in sight. I guess it's to hide most of the textures that look like they were made of clay, or the motion capture that's so bad you'd swear the game was made during the PS2's beta stages. The game looks dated and drizzly, but it doesn't detract from the overall atmosphere. On the contrary, it adds an extra layer of misery and grittiness to Santa Esperanza. I'm not normally like this, but I find the janky animations and amateurish texture work in places to be cute, though I guess that's probably because I like trauma movies. I mean, janky might as well be its own genre, enough people like it. On occasion, the game attempts to be Max Payne, and while I appreciate the cliches of that particular noir game, it just shows how doddery this one actually is. It works, but again, only in a very peculiar way that only a few people will find fascinating. As for the sound design, the music's good and I particularly like the theme, but the voice acting's brought down by bad writing and sometimes it's just a phoned-in performance. The story is good, missing a few of the right notes, but the song still sounds good nonetheless. You know how if Black Sabbath's Lady Evil didn't have the bass guitar but made up for it with more percussion? That kind of thing.
Before we drink whiskey and juice to the Lupin the Third soundtrack, it's time to close this case with my final thoughts.
It's badly written, badly animated, and has some questionable design choices, but thank God for human emotions and subjectivity. In the same way many walking simulators are a steaming pile of goat shit, Blues and Bullets can still be flawed in every sense of the word, but enjoyable nonetheless. And speaking of goat crap, it's not in the same way as nearly every single simulator game. It doesn't rely on being a rubbish game to be really fun. Despite its issues, this first episode had me hooked from the very start. Its characters have an ample amount of personality and mystique surrounding them, the places you go to are brimming with atmosphere, and the stakes are constantly raising to give you a thrilling experience. You can tell that a lot of care and passion has gone into making this game the best it can be. This isn't something I normally do, but I bought the season pass shortly after finishing this first episode. If I can expect this kind of quality and more, I'm comfortable paying for the next 4 episodes. However, I'd recommend you wait for the reviews for each episode before buying into that. Lasting just over an hour, the first episode of Blues and Bullets was well worth the £3.99 I paid for it, and I gladly returned to it to see how else I could change the story. I wasn't disappointed by this game that I was interested in shortly before its release, and therefore my expectations are rightfully high for future installments. This is a game I can easily recommend.
Until the next time, I'm Johnbonne, your #1 source for #2 games. I was going to do some kind of joke here about there's a different choice of actions to take, but quite frankly, I know what choice I'm going to make. Until the next time, I'll see you later. Ta-ta for now.